Alright, you've made it to topic 2.1. We're in the second unit here. Today we'll be introducing classical Greece. The goal for this lesson is for you to be able to describe the origins and key aspects of classical Greek culture. Now remember to be filling in those blanks as we go along and answer those reflection questions at the end. Just a helpful reminder, I'm going to be talking about more than just the words on the slides to give you additional context. So if there's something additional that you think is important to write down in your notes, I encourage you to add those to your notes using red font, of course. Alright, you'll remember from a previous lesson at the end of the last unit, the Bronze Age had collapsed, with all these civilizations kind of ending around the exact same time in the Near East, Eastern Mediterranean region. This leads to kind of a Dark Ages period, and especially in Greece, there is stuff happening, but life gets simpler as people who abandon cities are living in more traditional farming, rural areas. No one knows how to read or write anymore. Things have kind of gone backwards, but then Greece bounces back from this in a period that we call the classical period that we're going to be spending most of this unit talking about. A little more detailed timeline here. You can see some of the events that we've been talking about in the previous unit, right? So you can see Mycenaean civilization right here kind of coming to an end around 1100 BCE, and we don't see the classical Greek period starting until around 500 BCE. Around 800 BC, things are picking up again, but it takes a while for civilization to get going again, and that's why there's just this gap between like the end of the Greek Dark Ages and the beginning of the Classical period. Other things you might notice going on in other parts of the world during the Great Classical period, that's the Warring States period in China that we were talking about. The Zhou dynasty is going on during all of this right here, that during that Bronze Age collapse period over in China. So you can kind of see what's going on in relation to other areas we talked about already in this class. Our first key question to address here is, where did Greek culture come from? As everything came from something. So where did Greek culture come from? Well, the geography of Greece plays a really big role in their culture and its development. Geographically here, you can see the little map of the world here. This is the Mediterranean Sea, something you're going to be very familiar with in this class. And this red area is what we call Greece today. Zooming in more, here you can see more of a physical map here. So this is where Greece is. This is what's called the Peloponnesian Peninsula. And you can see all of Greece really covered in a lot of mountains here. So very mountainous peninsula surrounded by water on three sides. A lot of islands are part of this. The Aegean Sea here and the Ionian Sea here are going to be playing really big roles in Greek culture, especially because there's very limited farmland in which they can grow their own food. I mean, look here, this is the darker the color, the higher the mountains. And you can see most of Greece is covered in mountains, and that's not good land for farming. A key result of this is that the mountains are separating the Greek communities, and this encourages them to form independent city-states that we call polis, or the polis in the singular. Now, this is instead of forming a single unified empire that we're seeing in other areas of the world, like the Persians that we had talked about in the previous unit. So the Greeks are all kind of these independent city-states. They share a common culture, common religion. They worship the same gods. They speak the same language, and they cooperate during religious festivals. Sometimes they form alliances. Sometimes they trade with each other, and sometimes they go to war with each other. So you can see, well, during the Bronze Age, you saw these massive empires forming in Mesopotamia, in Anatolia, and Egypt, that united these different cultures. The Greeks are united by their culture, but they don't have a single government, and that's because it's really hard to travel across these mountains, and so they can't really easily be unified under a single ruler yet, but we'll get there. Now, on their east side, they have the Aegean Sea, and on their west, they have the Ionian Sea, and to their south, they have the Mediterranean Sea, and this is going to allow for easy travel and trade across the oceans, which will be key to their success. They have limited natural resources at home, especially food to farm from, so trade's going to be essential for their survival and for generation of wealth for this culture. And as populations grow too big to be sustained by the cities that the people grow up in, they start to send groups of people off into form what they call colonies, which will then spread Greek culture to other areas of the world, specifically southern Italy, Sicily, and Ionia to their east, which is where they're going to come in contact with the Persians. But we're going to get there soon. Culturally, they're heavily influenced by the Bronze Age Minoan civilization that was located right here on this island of Crete. So you see here, this is Greece, this is the island of Crete, and during the Bronze Age, the people of Crete had their own vibrant trade seafaring civilization, and a lot of their culture influences will come later with the Greeks, whether it's their art, their architecture, the way they built their buildings, their religious beliefs and writing systems. All this the Greeks will look back at and go, wow, there used to be a great civilization on Crete. Maybe we can borrow some of what they did to create our own culture. In fact, one famous Greek myth of the Minotaur and Theseus in the labyrinth fighting each other, this takes place on the island of Crete in a Minoan king's castle. That's when they believe it happened. Now, of course, this is a myth. It didn't really happen, but it's deeply connected to Minoan culture, showing how they influenced Greek culture. Now, the Mycenaeans, you can see right here, they're on the Peloponnesian Peninsula, a little north of that right here. They're located on the mainland of what will become Greece. So sometimes some people think of them as kind of proto-Greeks. The Mycenaeans were really the first Greek-speaking people to live in this area. They built fortified cities with palaces and castles. Their capital city, their main city was Mycenae. These are the people who actually went to war over here in Troy. That story is remembered by the Greeks in the story of the Trojan War in the Iliad and the Odyssey. So in many ways, the Greeks are just picking up where the Minoans and the Mycenaeans left off after a several hundred-year pause that was the Greek Dark Ages. And of course, we can't ignore the impact the Phoenician people had on Greek culture. So the Phoenicians came right here from the eastern edge of the Mediterranean Sea, this area called Phoenicia. Today we'd call it like Palestine, Israel, Levant, Canaan, a lot of different names for this area. But the Phoenicians were skilled sailors. They didn't really build an empire. Instead, while other cultures were building empires, the Assyrians and whatnot, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Phoenicians instead were more focused on sailing across the Mediterranean and trading with people. Their most important city during these early days is the city of Tyre right here. And that's going to come into our story a little bit later. But Tyre really is kind of the center of Phoenician culture. When that eventually gets destroyed, Phoenician culture shifts to the west and starts to focus on the city of Carthage over here, which will also come into play a little bit later when we get to the Romans. So all this is kind of building something. But you can see these red lines here show how the Phoenicians are really just traveling all over, creating trade networks. And as they're doing this, they're spreading a lot of their culture. In fact, one of their big contributions is their alphabet system. So the Phoenicians create this kind of alphabet system with exactly what you think it is, like different letters representing different sounds that can combine to write all kinds of words. Well, you can see here that this is the Phoenician letter A, which looks like the Greek letter A, just turned on its side, which is very much the English letter A we're using today. You can see the B also, right? You see C's. You can see the evolution of the Phoenician alphabet to the Greek alphabet to the alphabet that we use today. And so the Phoenicians are very influential for this reason. All right, let's talk about the role of religion in Greek culture. Now, I know Zeus, Ares, Apollo, Athena, these are names you're probably familiar with. We're not going to get too much in the weeds with that. Instead, we're more interested in looking at exactly how religion impacted Greek life, not so much on the specific myths the Greeks talked about. Like all religions, the Greeks used theirs to explain natural phenomenon, emotions, history, things they didn't really understand, right? So religion is about explaining things that we don't have answers to, and this is exactly how the Greeks used their faith. Now, they had a polytheistic faith. This meant that they worshiped not one, but many gods, very common at this time. Now, these gods were very much just thought of as really, really big humans with supernatural divine powers that kind of lived forever. So they took on a lot of very human traits. So these gods were very active in human lives. Sometimes it was believed they would help us. Sometimes it was believed they punished us. And sometimes it was believed that they were just kind of messing with us. See, in the more modern, say, Judeo-Christian Islamic faiths, you're going to have this idea of God is there to help. But in the Greek religion, the gods didn't really care. You were there basically to entertain the gods and not annoy them. This, again, was a common idea of gods back in the ancient times. So if a lightning bolt strikes, well, that's Zeus being upset or just kind of messing with you. There's stories of gods flirting with and impregnating human women. Right here we have Apollo trying to convince this priestess of Athena that she should sleep with him, and since she rejects him because she's supposed to remain a virgin, he punishes her for doing her religious duty by turning her into Medusa. And then there's the story of the Trojan walls, so powerful and strong that no one could get through them. They said, well, it must have been the gods who built it. So religion really unites these people who are actually divided politically, right? They live in different cities, but they worship the same gods, and then they celebrate in athletic games where each city competes against each other in order to honor these gods. And while every city-state worshiped the exact same gods, you'd find temples to Zeus, Apollo, Athena, Ares, in all the different Greek cities. Each city also picked specific gods that they said are their patrons, the gods that are extra super special and really important to that city because they said that god is in some way connected to it. Maybe they had a kid that was born there, maybe they helped build certain monuments inside the city. And so like Athens, for example, worshipped Athena and Poseidon as their main deities, but they also had temples to all the other gods. So then how do the Greek people govern themselves? Well, great question. And we're going to look at this through the lens of two of these cities, Athens and Sparta. And we're just do a really quick overview of it. We're going to dig more into this in a lesson that I like to call the Greek City-State Smackdown, where you're going to be researching different Greek cities. So as I mentioned earlier, Greeks really organize themselves by their polis, their city-state. And all a polis is a city surrounded by farmland that functioned independently of other city-states. Right? They may trade with, fight with, create alliances with other cities, but each city governed itself. In fact, today we talk about them as the ancient Greeks, but at the time, the term the Greeks really wouldn't resonate with them. Instead, they would say, I'm not Greek, I'm Athenian from the city of Athens, or I'm Spartan from Sparta, or I'm Corinthian from the city of Corinth. They really didn't identify as this larger idea of a Greek nation. However, they did again share that common language, common religion, even common heroes were created to create this cultural unity where there was no political unity. Each city kind of ran themselves their own way, right? They're independent of each other. Some were monarchies ruled by a king, others were oligarchies ruled by a few special powerful people, either because of their wealth or their military prowess, but it was a small group who had all the power. And then there was the first democracies, where it was actually ruled by the citizens. So let's just take a quick look at Athenian direct democracy, just a really broad overview. So in this system, instead of being ruled by a king who decided what the laws were, the citizens got together and voted for themselves, and they didn't even elect officials like we do today, like we elect a member of the Senate or the House to go and run things for us. The citizens actually voted on all the laws. They also served on juries and saw political participation as a duty. They said you couldn't be a full citizen unless you got political, because politics was the core of life. They also had a very, very strict hierarchy on who could participate in this. At the top of this hierarchy were your citizens. These were freeborn adult men. They were the only ones who could participate. And they would do so by openly debating and arguing about what should be done in the city. Below the citizens were the metics. These were free foreigners, so they weren't slaves. They just weren't citizens of Athens because their parents weren't citizens or they weren't granted citizenship. They were allowed to live in the city, work in the city, but they could not participate in government. And then at the very bottom, of course, there were slaves. They had no rights. They worked in homes, cleaning the houses, tutoring children. Some of them worked in the mines, mining for gold and silver and other resources. Others worked in farm fields. And so slavery was a core aspect of this. In fact, some Athenians argued the only way democracy can work is if wealthy people owned a lot of slaves who could do the busy work, so the wealthy people could spend more time thinking about the high-minded ideas of politics. This, of course, is completely wrong, but that is how the Greeks saw this. Now, this slavery was not based on skin color. It wasn't passed on from generation to generation. It was not the slavery that we had here in the United States. It wasn't good at all, actually. It was a terrible thing, but also not everyone's experience was exactly the same. If you were, say, bought as a slave to be a tutor for a wealthy family's child, you're going to be living a pretty comfortable life. But if you were forced into the mines as a slave for a criminal punishment, your life is going to be pretty miserable. So slavery has a very complex history in the world, and a lot of the ancient world is based on the work forced enslavement. This is something we will be getting into this class, but this is just a kind of first introduction into it. And then, of course, we can't forget women. Women were excluded from the government in pretty much all senses. They were forced to take care of the home and the families, raise children, do the weaving of cloth. They had pretty much no rights in Athenian society, and in fact, they were controlled by the male members of their family, whether that was their husband, their eldest brother, their dad. So Athenian society was pretty sexist. Education also reflected this, right? Education in general focused on producing well-rounded citizens, especially for boys. Boys focused on citizenship. They learned how to read, how to write, how to do math, how to play music, and at 18 they began military training in order to help defend the city. Girls, on the other hand, well, their main role was to manage households and raise children, so their education was more around how do you weave cloth, how do you raise a child, how do you manage a household. Again, pretty sexist. The Spartans, on the other hand, had a more military-focused oligarchy where they had a few ruling elites. They did have some elected positions. Their main thing, though, was they focused on discipline and military service. So whereas Athenians would start training their boys at the age of 18 to become soldiers, all men in Sparta were trained for war starting at the age of 7 when they were removed from their homes to start that military training. Their education was not focused on reading and writing or anything like that. No music, no math. It was basically the bare minimum to teach them how to survive, how to fight and how to be loyal to the Spartan state. Now, what's interesting here is that Spartan women actually had a lot more power in society than Athenian women did. And this is because Spartans believed the only way to produce strong Spartan men was to have them born to strong Spartan women. So women did get an education, much not as intense as the male education, but a lot of it did focus on physical exercise, physical training to make their bodies strong enough, the Spartans said, to produce strong Spartan men. Women also could own land and manage the homes during times of war, so they're actually much more powerful. I wouldn't say they were equal to the Spartan men, but they definitely had it a little bit better than the Athenian women in this sense. And of course, just like Athenians were dependent on slaves, Spartans were also dependent on and vastly outnumbered by their slaves. They referred to these people as the helots. They did pretty much all the tasks of working on the land, growing the food, building things. Spartan men, that wasn't something they worked on. Spartan men focused only on being ready for combat, and so they relied on the helots, their slaves, to do everything else to keep their society running. And because they were vastly outnumbered by the helots, the Spartans were always worried about slave rebellions. In fact, there was a slave rebellion that was almost successful that almost overthrew Spartan society, that then kind of launched the Spartans into this giant reimagining of how they should run their cities, focused solely around how do we stop our helots from ever revolting again. And their answer to this was extreme military dictatorship of their land, where everyone had to have military service in one way or another. All right, we'll talk more about the Spartans and the Athenians and other Greek city-states in our coming lesson, where you're going to be broken into groups and doing some research on your own on Greek city-states, and then you're going to be able to throw some shade at the other groups' city-states by digging up dirt on those cities. But for now, take a minute, rewrite today's goal, as I always ask you to do those 3 important facts from the notes, reflect on it, what things from these notes help you show you've met that goal, and then as always, show that critical thinking at the end, show me you're intellectually curious, and write at least one question about what we talked about in the notes, or anything else for that matter related to world history. Just show me your thinking. Alright, until next time.